Hello everyone, and welcome back to yet another episode of Journey Through Norse Mythology. Now, today we are tackling the topic of the war between the two pantheons of gods in Norse mythology, the Aesir, that being Odin and his kin, and the Vanir, the other pantheon of gods that live in Vanaheim. Now, Vanir are a very vague group, to say the least. We know almost nothing about them from the sources we have, and even the meaning of the word Vanir eludes us to this day. The few things we do know, however, are the main figureheads of the Vanir. There was Njord, the god of fertility and wealth, but also of sea, which might suggest that his godhood over fertility and wealth was linked with the sailors and fishermen, who might have prayed to Njord for safe voyage and a good haul. Other prominent figures within the Vanir pantheon were Njord's children. His daughter, Freyja, was a goddess of beauty and fertility in both agriculture and sexual sense, and his son Frey was a god of fertility as well, but also of health, peace, and wealth. And as these three gods are the only prominent Vanir gods we know of, you can imagine why the Vanir are often talked about as gods of fertility. Another very interesting thing to note here is that the Vanir weren't originally Norse gods. Though their origin can't be precisely determined, some scholars assume they might have originated among the seafaring peoples of the Baltic and southern shores of the North Sea. These regions were often targets of Viking raids, and so it wouldn't be unimaginable that over the course of several centuries of the raiders coming in contact with the foreign religions, the worship of the Vanir gods might have spread to Scandinavia. This might pose the question, why did not such a thing occur during the height of the Viking Age, when the Viking raids were more focused on plundering the Christian lands? To answer that, we must realize that the Old Norse religion and Christianity are fundamentally different. Even though Old Norsemen and the Baltic folk may have worshipped different gods, the fundamental similarity between their religions remains the same. They are polytheist religions. They worship a wide pantheon of gods, and each god fills a certain role and is tied to some aspect of the believer's life. Thor, for example, is the ideal of a mighty warrior and a protector by keeping the giants at bay so that humans may live in peace, and so he was revered by both the warrior class and the common folk. Odin, on the other hand, was the model of a strong ruler and a wise man, thus he was seen as a patron for kings and other rulers. However, Odin was also a god of war, and even though an average warrior would besiege Thor or Tyr to give him strength in battle, the leaders and the berserkers were the ones who called upon Odin to grant them success in battle. Overall, both the Old Norse society and their gods were quite violent and warlike, and with this in mind, we'll see how polytheism can be quite flexible indeed. We talked earlier in this video about the three main Vanir gods, Njord, Frey, and Freyja. Notice any difference between them and the Aesir gods? While the Aesir are mostly associated with things like war, strength, and power, the Vanir are gods of things like fertility, love, and wealth. Vanir are clearly a product of a less violent society than the Aesir. And these glaring differences between the Aesir and Vanir gods are the reason why mergence of such fundamentally different pantheons can be, and in this case actually has proven to be, a healthy process that enriches the religion greatly. Freyja and Frey would both become very important and venerated gods within the Old Norse religion and its practices. Things like these only show how two different points of view can learn and benefit so much from each other. However, that is not the case with the monotheist religions such as Christianity. The very concept of one god stands completely against the message of polytheism. There is no variety, there are no different points of view that can be shared. There is only one God above all, and his way is the only way, and all that do not accept that are heathen savages. This is why Christianity was despised by not only the Old Norsemen, but other people who practice a polytheist religion. A monotheist religion completely crushes the idea of wide acceptance and open mind that led to the creation of any gods in the first place. Now, there of course were Norsemen in the Viking Age who accepted Christianity, whether it was for the gain of gold, opportunity, or sometimes even simply accepting it. But overall, Christianity wasn't welcomed with open arms by those who practiced the Old Norse religion. Alright, now that we've talked about the real-life process that probably merged the two pantheons together, let's explore the mythological version. One thing I want you to know before I start is that the accounts of the Aesir-Vanir war are scarce in the Norse myths, and even though we have the basic skeleton of how it began, how it went, and how it was resolved, any precise detail eludes us. And so because of that, I will use my imagination to fill in some blanks within this story that I consider to be feasible within the context we already have. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get started. Our story begins with Freya, the Vanir goddess of love and fertility, but more importantly, one of the few practitioners of Seder in the universe. Seder in Norse mythology is essentially what we would call magic. It is a force that can be used for many things, controlling the weather and the elements, healing, shape-shifting, the ability to see the future, and many others. But more importantly, it can be used to rewrite the course of one's destiny. The Norns are the foremost practitioners of Seder, and no one can even dream of matching their skill. To set things into perspective, we can compare any other practitioner of Seder to a salmon trying to jump upstream of a raging river, while the Norns are the ones who had made the river in the first place. The salmon may manage to swim up against the river's current, carving his way through the waters of fate, so to say. However, he has not even the slightest chance of changing the river's overall course. To summarize, reshaping the course of one's destiny does not in any way change the outcome of it. As I said in the video about Yggdrasil, the destiny in Norse mythology holds sway over gods, men and monsters alike, and although the path can take all manner of turns and twists, the end of the line always remains the same. Going back to Freya, we definitely have to mention that she wasn't quite the innocent flower that the title of goddess of love and fertility might make her out to be. Even though she was a goddess of love, she was also a patron to lovers. She enjoyed the pleasures of life and her ability to sway men by her beauty and influence. One day, however, Freya got bored of seducing mortal men, as they never possessed any real challenge to her womanly talents. And so instead, Freya decided to venture to a place she heard so much about, the dwelling of the 3 giant slayers. These 3 giant slayers were of course Odin and his brothers Willi and Way, and the dwelling in question was no other than Asgard, at the time, still small fort with but a few obscure gods living there. After all, this was a time when the gods and the cosmos were still young, and deities such as Thor and Heimdall were not yet even been conceived. Freya decided to make it a challenge for herself and see if her talents were enough to sway even gods, and so she ventured to Asgard, introducing herself as a traveling sorceress under the name of Hera, and she offered her skills in magic to the gods, claiming that they would revere her for her services. The gods were wary of her claims, because even though the practitioners of Seder were respected for their skill and power, they were feared and distrusted for it at the same time. After all, how could individuals with such power be trusted not to misuse it for their own selfish and sinister intents? After some persuading from the gorgeous sorceress, however, the gods agreed and led her into their home. And no sooner than that day did Freya started using her charms, both magical and womanly. She spent some time with the gods, meeting with each of them individually and offering them both her services in magic arts and of course carnal pleasures that none was able to decline. And as time passed, Freya casted her charms over the gods, who sought her company and services more and more. Freya enjoyed being desired, and she couldn't deny that the way the gods competed over her time and attention was an entertainment she never experienced before. To hold sway over such mighty beings triggered such strong feeling of power and dominance deep within her that the Vanir goddess quickly got drunk on the control she had over the gods of Asgard. Freya began to provoke the gods and set them against each other by pretending to favor one over the other, only to find a new favorite the next day, sowing seeds of jealousy and discord amongst them. And as time passed, Freya pushed the gods more and more, testing just how much she could bend them to her will, and even though she was entertained beyond belief, her machinations would in the end be her undoing. One day the gods were done with competing for Freya's affection amongst each other, as they finally realized how her toying with their minds and feelings clouded their judgment and set them against each other. The gods decided that they would end Freya's game, as well as take revenge upon her for her actions by killing her. Branding her as Gullveig, they seized her and tied her to a pole, and proceeded with hurling spears at her. However, Freya laughed heartily as her magic deflected the incoming javelins, shielding her from any harm. The gods were unsettled by the futility of their efforts, as well as Freya's mockery, but by no means were they discouraged in acting out their revenge, and thus they decided to burn the now cackling sorceress. 3 times they burned Freya to nothing more than a pile of ash, and every time she had risen up from the ashes again, unscathed and laughing all the way. This only shows Freya's skill in Seder, as she was able to reweave the thread of her destiny so that she would be able to return even after death. As we said, the path of fate can take numerous shapes and routes before it comes to an end, and as Freya's death has not been destined for that day, she was able to escape it with relative ease. After a 3rd attempt on her life, however, the witch goddess grew bored and instead vanished as a cloud of vapor, leaving the gods of Asgard befuddled, though relieved, as they thought Freya's disappearance meant this would be the end of the misfortunes she brought upon them. What they did not know was that Freya returned to her home in Vanaheim, and her kin did not take lightly to the attempted murder of one of their own, and quickly rallied their armies to march against the Aesir. Odin and his brothers weren't ones to shy away from combat, and so as soon as they saw the Vanir armies from their walls, they massed their own army and rode out to meet them. Who actually comprised the armies of the Aesir and the Vanir is something unknown to us, but if I were to guess, and this is pure speculation, I would say it might have been the elves. We talked previously that the elves and the gods shared a special bond, and that the elves lived in Asgard alongside the Aesir, and we also know that Frey, the Vanir god, is actually the lord of Alfheim, the home of the elves. And so it wouldn't be such a stretch to imagine the elves rallying to protect their home, that being Asgard, and also coming to aid their lord, that being Frey. This is, however, a pure speculation on my part, but I don't think that Valhalla was even an idea at this point in time in the universe of Norse mythology, and I personally take the Æsir-Vanir war as a very important event in Odin's life, and an experience that would be a stepping stone for many changes in his life. But I will explain more on that later. Now, given the settings of the story, I would argue that Odin and his brothers were still young gods, driven by lust for battle and combat rather than coming up with strategy and tactics. Their defeat of Ymir and the hordes of his kin blinded them with pride and overconfidence, and they were too confident in their own strength and battle prowess that they didn't realize they now faced entirely different circumstances than when they fought and defeated the giants. And I would also say that the experiences Odin will have in this war were what made him later set aside his more warrior-like nature and start studying the art of war. Because the Æsir-Vanir war was not even nearly as one-sided as you might think. I'd say that a quote from Sun Tzu is quite appropriate in this case. Quote, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not to fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory you gain you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle." End quote. And oh, did Odin and his brothers know their own strength, but underestimated that of the Vanir. They rode out of Asgard in a battle frenzy, ready to clash with the Vanir forces. The Vanir, however, as not such a warrior-like sort as the Aesir were, took a more cautious approach. They knew they could not match the strength of the Aesir in battle, but they also realized one important asset they possessed: Freya's magic. A plan was set in motion then, and Frey and his father Njord stopped their armies before reaching Asgard, close enough so that the Aesir would surely spot them, but far enough so that they wouldn't reach them as soon as they rode out of the gates. At the same time, Freya, in the shape of a falcon, flew over the approaching armies of Asgard and settled on one of the trees overlooking the, at the time, still simple wooden walls. As Odin and his brothers rushed their army against the Vanir forces, the lords of Vanaheim gave a command to retreat. The overconfident Aesir pushed their army to go faster, thinking the very sight of their forces sent the Vanir to flight, but unknowingly they played right into their enemy's plan. The Vanir kept up their retreat, just fast enough for them to stay slightly ahead of the Aesir, but slow enough so their enemy wouldn't give up the pursuit. And when Odin hurled his spear deep into the Vanir ranks, killing many in the process, Njord commanded his son to give Freya the signal to spring the trap. Frey lifted a massive horn to his lips and blew with all his might. As Freya heard the sound, she turned back into her true form to fulfill her role in the Vanir plan. The goddess outstretched her hands, and through her magic called upon the power of the wind and earth, bending the elements to her will as she clenched her fists. The walls of Asgard were hit with what could only be described as a hurricane, reducing the wooden palisade that shielded the realm of the Aesir to shreds. At the same time, Freya commanded the earth to crack open, and with a mighty sound the ground split asunder, and a gaping cavern swallowed what was left of Asgard's walls. The sound of Freya's doing was heard all the way at the distant battlefield, where Odin and his brothers turned in surprise and watched in shock as the fortifications of their home crumbled to the ground. The Aesir stood in awe of the terrible show of power, and in their moment of confusion arrows began to fly from the Vanir army, catching the Aesir off guard. Odin and his brothers shouted at each other in a cacophony of whistling arrows and screaming elves who were pierced by them. While Odin wanted to retreat to secure their home, which he presumed would be destroyed if they would act otherwise, his brothers wanted to stay and fight the Vanir. The brothers got into a heated argument, neither one willing to back down, but during their quarrel they lost too many of their force, and so Willy and Ve finally caved in and sounded a retreat. This first battle, if it can be even called that, ended in a crushing victory for the Vanir. Dealing a significant blow to Asgard's armies and decimating their home, the Vanir marched back, thinking this lesson would be enough to teach the Aesir not to mess with them again. The Aesir retreated back to their home, beaten but not defeated. The fires of war still burned strong within their hearts, and lust for vengeance drove them on. For some time, nothing but smoke and light of forge fires could be seen coming out of Asgard, both throughout the day and night. And finally, one day, armies clad in steel and gold rode out of Asgard and headed to Vanaheim to execute their vengeance. The Aesir hit the home of the Vanir hard and plundered their lands as they saw fit, before Vanir mustered their armies again to push them back. The two forces faced off in battle many times, though ultimate victory was never achieved by either side. The Aesir's superior forces defeated the Vanir armies many times, only to be then laid waste to by Freya's magic. And so, after a long, exhausting and bloody conflict, Odin finally listened to his trusted counselor and wise god Mimir, and decided to seek an audience with the Vanir and sue for peace. The Vanir, smitten by the war as much as the Aesir were, agreed to the request, and so a meeting was held to decide the terms of the peace between the two pantheons. There was a debate about how would the Aesir repay for the war and damages they've caused to the Vanir, as it was the Aesir who instigated the war in the first place by assaulting Freya. But instead of paying reparations, the Aesir offered a different way of compensating the Vanir. Quote, "Then saw the gods their assembly seats, the holy ones and council held, whether the gods should tribute give, or to all alike should worship belong." End quote. And so it was decided that the Aesir would allow the mortals that worshipped them praise the gods of the Vanir in the same way. With Vanir now amply compensated, there now remained only the issue of how to ensure that the peace remained, and so the gods agreed that as an insurance they would exchange members of their respective pantheons. It was decided that Njord, Freya and Frey would come to live in Asgard with the Aesir, but since Njord was the ruler of Vanaheim, the Vanir expected a fitting member of the Aesir to take his place. The Aesir, however, decided to trick the Vanir, and instead giving the Vanir a god who would be fit to handle Njord's ruling duties, they've sent a god named Hænir to Vanaheim. Hænir was by no means a bright individual, but he was tall, handsome and muscular, and so on the first glance he seemed to be a strong and respectable man, and it was all the Aesir needed. They also sent Odin's advisor Mimir with Hænir to ensure he would have someone wise by his side whenever something was required of him. And this worked for some time. Whenever Hænir was expected to fulfill some duties or decide an important issue, he had Mimir by his side, whispering to him just what he needed to say or do. And so, with the terms of the truce settled, and with each side satisfied, the Vanir and the Aesir sealed their agreement by spitting into a ritual bowl, and from their spit a new being emerged, a man, created from their combined saliva and sharing all their wisdom and knowledge, making him the wisest being in all of cosmos. The gods named the man Kvasir, and to test his wisdom they asked him all manner of questions, and there was not one he could not answer. Kvasir then set off to wander around the cosmos and offer his wits to anyone who might need them. And both the Aesir and Vanir, now satisfied with their truce, ventured back to their homes. However, in time the Vanir started to notice that whenever Hænir didn't have Mimir by his side, his wit and wisdom seemed to magically disappear, and to issues and duties he was presented with, he would simply answer, "Let others decide." One day, however, the Vanir finally realized they have been deceived by the Aesir, and that Mimir was behind Hænir's seemingly disappearing and reappearing wisdom. The Vanir didn't want to start the war anew, far too aware of the consequences it would bring, and so instead they murdered Mimir and sent his head to Odin as a message, meaning that they knew how he deceived them, and that for the collective good he should keep his lips sealed about Mimir's murder if he didn't want a terrible war to start anew. Odin wept and mourned over the loss of his trusted advisor and close friend, but he understood that for the peace to remain, he could not seek vengeance. However, since the time the Vanir gods came to Asgard, Odin started to learn the ways of magic from Freya, recognizing their power and usefulness. And thanks to the art of Seder he had learned thus far, Odin emballed Mimir's head in herbs, and chanting magical formulas over it, he was able to bring it back to life. And thus Odin brought back his trusted advisor and friend, and he would often seek his company to speak and ponder over the mysteries of the universe and secrets of both life and death. And with that, our story for today has come to an end. Next time, we'll speak of the one we know truly provoked the war in the first place, of the wonderful and terrible goddess, and of the possible fact she might be more than one character in Norse mythology. But this would be all for today, and I bid you all farewell until next time.